Welcome, everyone. We got an exciting show today and a big audience, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to This is CDR, episode 63. This is CDR is an online event series presented by OpenAir to explore the range of carbon removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and really to contextualize them for policy proposals that OpenAir seeks to advance in the US, as well as in national and subnational jurisdictions globally. My name's Toby Bryce. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York, and I work on CDR policy advocacy and market development with OpenAir. If you've not done so, please introduce yourself in the chat and tell us where you're zooming in from. And everyone, be sure to direct that message to everyone and not just hosts and panelists, so the whole audience can see who's here. Just some quick background on OpenAir. If you're not familiar with our organization, we're an all-volunteer network dedicated to advancing carbon removal. We're a global community. We work on shared open source projects that we call missions in the areas of research and development, messaging and communications, policy advocacy, and activist market development. Tons of projects going on. Chris Neidel, our co-founder, is running the chat, and he will put a link there so that you can sign up to join what we're doing. Here's an example of the range of projects we're working on. We probably have 30, 35 live missions at any given time. Again, working on all these ranges of projects, and we'd love to have you be a part of what we're doing. Before we get started, as always, we like to define our terms. This is a definition of carbon removal from the CDR primer, which is a fantastic online document, and also you can get a hard copy, which I encourage everyone to do. It's a nice thing to have by your desk. Carbon removal is purposeful human activity to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and durably store it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in long-lived products. This is also essentially the same definition that the IPCC uses, and we think it's a good one to be working with. Two really important things to call out when we talk about carbon removal. Number one is to disambiguate it from quote-unquote carbon capture, which typically means when it's used in the media or otherwise, capturing CO2 from an emission source, whether it's a natural gas power plant or a cement plant. This may or may not be a good climate solution, depending on the socioeconomic, techno-economic, and other characteristics of a given project. But one thing it's clearly not is carbon removal, which again is removing CO2 from the atmosphere and durably putting it away for a long time. Number two, when we talk about carbon removal, it's critical to call out that carbon removal is pretty meaningless in the absence of extremely steep emissions reductions. We need to reduce emissions and decarbonize our global economy as quickly and as completely as possible, full stop. We have to reduce emissions. That said, there's clear scientific consensus that carbon removal will be required at gigaton scale by mid-century if we want to have any chance of limiting warming to 1.5 or even 2 degrees Celsius. And we're currently at kiloton scale, so we have a lot of work to do to get started. There are two reasons for the requirement for carbon removal. Number one, we're not going to be able to reduce all emissions in a climate relevant time frame. The best example of a hard to abate sector is agriculture and food systems, which are a third of global emissions, and we're just not, practically speaking, or from an equity perspective, going to be able to eliminate all those emissions by 2050. Number two, we already have 1 trillion plus tons trillion plus gigatons of CO2 in the atmosphere, anthropogenic CO2 in the atmosphere. And in the second half of the century, we're going to need to start removing the anthropogenic CO2 from the atmosphere in order to stabilize our climate and return it to a healthier state. So for those two reasons, we're going to need carbon removal alongside steep emissions reductions and also adapting to our change to climate to meet our climate goals. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Megha Raghavan, who will talk a little bit about run of show and introduce today's speaker.
Hey everyone, I'm Megha. I am an OpenAir member based in London, and I work on policy advocacy as well. This week, we're very excited to welcome Carbon to Stone founder Dr. Greeshma Gadikota of Cornell Engineering, who will present the startup's novel DAC approach that replaces conventional solvent regeneration using heat or pressure changes with direct mineralization of low-cost alkaline waste, such as steel slag, significantly reducing the energy and thus the cost required. The captured CO2 is durably stored as solid carbonate materials that can be used for building materials and other industrial purposes. Dr. Greeshma Gadikota is an assistant professor and Croll Sesquicentennial fellow in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering, with an appointment in chemical and biomolecular engineering at Cornell University. She directs the Sustainable Energy and Resource Recovery Group. She held postdoctoral appointments at Princeton and Columbia University and a researcher appointment at NIST. Her PhD in chemical engineering and MS degrees in chemical engineering and operations research are from Columbia University. She is a recipient of the DOE, NSF, and Arrow Career Awards, Sigma Chi Young Investigator Awards, Cornell Engineering Research Excellence Award, Inaugural Cornell Rising Women Innovator Award, and AICHE Sabic Award for Young Professionals. So whenever you're ready, over to you.
Hi, Megha. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. And Toby, thank you so much for really setting the stage for, I would say, CDR technologies. With that said, I'm going to jump right in. So I have a sense that a lot of us here in the audience already are primed to, to the issue of carbon dioxide removal. So with that perspective, without going too much into detail around some of the, I would say, some of the urgency that is needed for CDR, I'm just going to jump right in. So this tech for removing CO2 from air and mineralizing it really came from more than 5 years of work. So I'm a faculty member, and I often am the hardest person to convince. So we really needed to dot our T's, and we really needed to dot our I's and cross our T's before we could even consider bringing a technology like this to the marketplace. And really, I would say our work is motivated by the fact that there's more than 10 billion tons of CO2 removal that is actually needed by 2050. And there's about 20 billion tons per year of alkaline industrial waste that's actually generated. A lot of the work that I'm going to present this morning is inspired by a conversation that I had with Nucor that came to us with this problem of slag management. They weren't looking at slags from the perspective of carbon mineralization or storage, but for them, it was a nuisance because it has a lot of manganese and chromium. So if it was left untreated, or if it was just used straight up in building materials or in pavements, there is a risk that some of that chromium and magnesium could actually leach over time and could actually end up in drinking water resources. And so we came up with the solution of actually harnessing some of the alkalinity in a wide range of different residues from the perspective of carbon removal, but also harnessing some of the metals that are present in these resources from the perspective of resource recovery. So with that said, a lot of us are familiar with the inorganic carbon cycle, right? And we know that there is CO2 in the atmosphere. If you just leave a lime solution outside, hopefully not on a very windy day, you'll see that it's eventually going to mineralize. So that's something that we're all familiar with. Now, the question really is, how do we take a process that nature knows how to execute, is thermodynamically favorable, and actually turn it into something of value? So that's where carbon to stone steps in. And there are multiple advantages to be realized from such a technology. The first is carbon removal and durable storage. The second is being able to produce aggregates from anthropogenic carbonaceous resources, being able to recover energy critical metals, avoiding tipping fees from landfilling these wastes, and also avoiding environmental risks. So now the question is, how do we actually differentiate the technology that we have with respect to what already exists? So if you look at conventional approaches for capturing CO2 and mineralizing them, it's actually a multi-step approach. And this is something that's been studied for many, many years. So the process for CO2 capture is not something new. The first set of patents, I think, came out around the 1930s. They were put out by a person called Bottoms, who used monoethanolamine to capture CO2 from flue gas streams. So monoethanolamine can actually be used to capture CO2 from air as well. And over the course of the past century, there's been a lot of advances, and now we know a lot more about CO2 capture solvents than we knew, than we ever thought we would know. So where we're really headed with this is that with CO2 capture technologies, typically we need an absorber with a solvent, and the solvent captures CO2 from a dilute source. The CO2-loaded solvent is then sent into a regeneration column, which typically operates at a slightly higher temperature or a slightly different pressure compared to the absorption column. And this difference in temperature or pressure actually causes the solvent to be regenerated and to be sent back into this absorber column for more CO2 capture. The output that comes out of this regeneration column is high purity CO2, and now we then we can now use the CO2 for further mineralization. So if we were to implement such a process for direct air capture mineralization, first, it's a multi-step process. Each of these processes occur at different temperature conditions. And if you look at the economics of this, it's upwards of $250 per ton of CO2 that's captured and mineralized directly from air. So it's very expensive. So what we tried to come up, so we came up with an alternative solution, and our solution is this. First, we can look at the alkalinity that's actually present in a residue. So we can take a slag material, for example. And some of these slags have a lot of manganese, iron, and other materials. So we could actually put it through an electrochemical process, as I've shown here. And some of the outputs of that electrochemical process are calcium magnesium hydroxide, as well as a solution that is concentrated in the energy critical metals themselves. We can now take the calcium magnesium hydroxide and we can use that for direct air capture, or we could use that to capture CO2 from air, and we just store the carbonate. So that's our solution for capture and removal with the potential for utilization as building materials. So here for this audience, we're focused on direct air capture. And what is to note is that in some scenarios, it doesn't make sense to harness the alkaline resource for metal recovery. This is particularly in residues that really don't have very high quantities of energy critical metals, in which case we just bypass this entire step at the top and go straight to direct air capture and mineralization. So most of the economics that I'm going to show you and the life cycle assessment that I'm going to show you later on is for a material that can be directly mineralized and something from which we don't have a need to recover metals, if I may. Having said that, we have patents for how we could recover a wide range of different metals, including iron, nickel, cobalt, manganese, platinum, palladium. We're also able to recover rare earth elements and lithium as well. That's a whole other topic in and of itself. So I just want to stay focused on our carbon removal strategy here. And we envision having two different set of customers for a direct air capture mineralization solution and a flue gas capture mineralization solution. So our customers for direct air capture include companies such as Stripe and Shopify, Amazon, Meta, and hard to abate sectors, if you would, that really need to purchase carbon removal credits in the open market. For flue gas capture, we can also partner with industries that emit CO2 emissions, including iron and steel, aluminum, and such. That doesn't mean to say that we cannot partner with these companies on direct air capture, because we absolutely can. And I will show you examples of how such a partnership can actually come about. So to walk you through some chemistry here, and I'm a chemical engineer by training, so I need to show you some chemical reactions so I can actually sleep better at night. So here's the chemistry for the direct air capture of CO2, right? So if we do not have a solvent in the system, we effectively dissolve the CO2 in the aqueous phase. And then once we add the solvent to the system, we're able to either form a carbamate or a bicarbonate-rich solution. What we can then do is we can transfer the CO2-loaded solvent over to a liquid solid reactor. And into that reactor, we actually put in the alkaline resources. These alkaline resources react with the CO2-loaded solvents to produce solid carbonates. And in the process of doing that, the solvent actually gets regenerated. And so now we're able to loop the solvent back in for more CO2 capture from air. So effectively, this process replaces conventional temperature and pressure-based swing strategies for producing high purity CO2. The process that we've listed here for direct air capture is a two-step process. We could actually execute a process like this in a single-step process, as I've shown here, if you have higher concentrations of CO2. But that's, again, a whole other topic in and of itself. So with that said, I just wanted to give you a sense of the extensive carbon mineralization that we see in various kinds of materials. So if we have calcium oxide, we're able to mineralize close to 100% of that in less than 3 hours using a wide range of different solvents. So here we've looked at monoethanolamine, which is represented by this black line. Sodium glycinate also works really well. We also have more complex amines like AMP and DBU. Though these are known as tertiary amines or cyclic amines, respectively. But the key here is to make sure that the solvent has certain attributes. The first is that it has to be environmentally benign. The second is that it needs to be less corrosive. The third is that it needs to have high CO2 capture capacity. The fourth is that it needs to be able to let go of the CO2 to facilitate the mineralization more effectively. And one of the solvents that actually meets these four criteria is sodium glycinate. So sodium glycinate is environmentally benign. It has similar CO2 capture efficiencies as MEA. It's less corrosive and it's more environmentally benign than MEA. So if you look at calcium silicate, for example, there's a lot of calcium silicate in alkaline residues, by the way, particularly slags. You'll see that we're able to get extensive carbon mineralization of about 30%. Which is actually very, very attractive because the process takes place at 50 or 75 degrees centigrade with 1 molar sodium glycinate. And this is, again, not using very high temperatures or very high pressures. With MgO, we're able to get more than 70% conversion. And again, this is very attractive if you're looking at brucite-rich or magnesium oxide or magnesium hydroxide-rich mine tailings. So after publishing several papers, more than 7 papers, and filing a patent, we finally convinced ourselves that this was actually worth doing and worth scaling up. So just to give you a sense of how this technology stacks up against passive mineralization. So passive mineralization is a technology where we just expose mine tailings or ground rock, and we expect that they will mineralize over time. They'll capture CO2 from air and they'll slowly mineralize. So here we have a really good example of Nucor Slato slag. So Nucor Slato slag has just been sitting out for many months, and we noticed that over time it naturally captures CO2, and we're able to capture about 0.18 grams of the CO2 per gram of feedstock. But with our process, we're able to achieve a 4 to 5-fold increase in the CO2 that's actually captured. So this is a very effective engineered strategy for fully utilizing the entire alkaline content as opposed to just partially using the alkaline content. Another key consideration is looking at different kinds of legacy waste. So for example, coal fly ash can be considered to be a legacy waste. So if we simply react that in pure water, we just bubble CO2 through pure water, and we have a slurry of the fly ash with the water, we'll see that we get mineralization that's about 15% or so. But the moment we introduce sodium glycinate into the system, we get extensive mineralization that are 4 to 5-fold higher. So this is very attractive from the perspective of achieving higher efficiency in mineralization, because we eliminate the slow step, which is the CO2 dissolution in water. Now, in terms of LCA, we can take a look to understand the levers that we can effectively tune to achieve more effective carbon removal. So here we looked at solvent use, we looked at transportation, we looked at replacing calcium carbonate in the marketplace, so replacing natural calcium carbonate with anthropogenic calcium carbonate. We looked at energy needs and chemical conversion. So we have positive emissions and we have negative emissions. And what you'll notice is that we actually start getting to carbon negative scenarios if you're able to regenerate and recover more of the solvent per cycle. So to achieve net carbon negative for a situation where we have about 20% of the solids loaded, we need to have at least 93% of the solvent that is regenerated or recovered per cycle. Similarly, if we're looking at alkaline residues, we need to achieve reactivities that are more than 80% or higher in order to achieve net carbon negative scenarios. Again, this is assuming that we're transporting the solids, assuming that we're using fossil fuels for transportation, and such. So some of the most effective ways to actually achieve higher levels of carbon removal are to co-locate our facility with the alkaline resource itself, so we avoid the emissions associated with transportation. Another strategy is to increase the solvent recovery efficiency. Another strategy is to actually replace calcium carbonate in the built environment. Well, is to replace, I would say, more specifically, natural calcium carbonate with the calcium carbonate that we are synthesizing. So here we have a figure. This is from a very long time ago, from when I was a PhD student. And so our team actually showed that if you replace a small quantity of OPC, about 10 to 20% of OPC, with carbonated stainless steel slag, you're able to increase the compressive strength of these materials by a factor of 2. So effectively, our base case is this black line, and replacing that OPC with 10% calcium carbonated stainless steel slag doubles the compressive strength. So this shows that even substituting 10, 15% of OPC with some of these carbonates can actually make for a much more robust built environment. So this is very promising. In terms of looking at both the positive CO2 emissions as well as the net negative CO2 emissions, we ran a very conservative case with a slag material that is not as reactive compared to the slag that I'd shown you earlier, but is more representative of the general classes of slags. And what we found was that on a net basis, we are able to remove more than 250 kilograms of CO2 per ton of gross CO2 emission. Again, this is a very conservative scenario. I would call this the lower bound. And there are ways to actually increase the carbon removal efficiency. And one of them is by increasing the solvent recovery that I talked to you about earlier. Another strategy is to actually integrate the entire process with waste heat that is available in an industrial facility or harness low-grade geothermal heat. Another strategy is to avoid transportation altogether by co-locating a modular DAC unit with an industrial facility. So here, the logistics of transportation play a very important role. So in terms of the economics, how do we stack up? So we did an analysis for the cost of the CO2 capture and mineralization. And the cost in the range of about $80 to $125 per ton of CO2 that's removed and mineralized directly from air. If we did this with flue gas, that's about 4 volume percent ranging to about 20 volume percent, the costs of CO2 capture and mineralization are much lower. They're in the range of $35 to $55 per ton. So again, these numbers are not just for direct air capture, it's for capture and mineralization. And there's several additionality benefits as well. We reduce metal contamination of the water resources and soils. We help advance a carbon negative built environment. We limit the landfilling of alkaline residues, and we can actually turn hazardous legacy emissions, such as mine tailings, into relatively benign forms. And there are several revenue sources that can also be realized. So the first is being able to achieve a revenue of about $180 per ton based on the 45Q tax credits. There is a lot of valuable metals that's actually present in some of these slags. And so if you're able to recover those, the value can be upwards of $1,000 per ton of industrial waste that's processed. And we eliminate the tipping fees altogether for disposing some of these alkaline residues. There's also a revenue stream associated with using the carbonates, and we anticipate that's somewhere in the range of $15 to $20 per ton of carbonate-bearing aggregates. So there is actually potential to be profitable while doing good for the environment here. And one of the key advantages is that because our process is engineered storage, it's easily verifiable. We're able to achieve high levels of mineralization in 3 hours or less. Our processes occur at temperatures below 80 degrees centigrade. Sometimes if it's calcium rich, it can actually occur at room temperature. If it's magnesium rich, then we have to go up to temperatures in the range of 50 to 75. But either way, it's much more, I would say, less heat intensive compared to some of the other DAC approaches that are available. There's substantial revenue opportunities, and we do have the opportunity to scale up with specific industry partners. So here, one approach to think about DAC is not so much from the perspective of having a large centralized facility, but actually having smaller modularized DAC units that can be co-located with the availability of these alkaline resources. So there's been a lot of interest from several industry partners. So we're working with Nucor very closely, Novelis, which does secondary aluminum recycling. So if you've ever wondered what happens to your aluminum cans, they actually end up at Novelis, where they take them and then they make pure aluminum out of that. We are working with still water critical minerals as well. Again, this is all relatively early stage, exploring opportunities for DAC and metal recovery coupled with mineralization. And there's a lot of interest from companies such as Chevron and Saudi Aramco because they produce oil and gas brines that tend to have high concentrations of lithium alongside calcium and magnesium. So we're looking at resource recovery coupled with mineralization. So it's a slightly different, we have a set of patents we think we can apply there. It's a different iteration of our technology, but nonetheless, it's very promising. For now, our customers include Frontier, Stripe, and Shopify, and we're actively exploring DAC Hub opportunities, particularly in the New York area with some of the industry partners such as Novelis and Nucor that are actually located here in New York. So here's to give you a sense of what we anticipate will be our technology development cycle. So a lot of foundational research has already happened. At this point, we're looking at more effective reactor configurations to assist with the solvent recovery components so we can drive the costs down further, as well as reduce the emissions further. We've established the company, we've engaged industry partners. We're in the process of pre-piloting our technology with the intention of going to pilot over the course of the next 18 months or so. And we're effectively looking to move towards a commercial demo plant over the course of the next 3 to 4 years. And starting 2028, we are looking to establish production facilities, if you would. So with that said, I'm very grateful for a very talented team of partners. So 2 of my most talented postdocs, Hasnain Hasgar and Sohaib Mohammed, joined Carbon to Stone. They have extensive experience on various aspects of mineralization. I'm also joined by Shavant, who has more than 20 years of experience in the pharmaceutical industry, commercializing high-risk innovations. So I'm glad that he's able to bring some of that expertise to the company. Also very grateful to Cornell University, particularly the Praxis Center for Venture Development, as well as a legal counsel, our communication and accounting teams for getting us this far. So with that said, really a warm thank you to several funding sources and their generosity, which has really helped us get to this point as far as tech development is concerned. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you for your time.
Greeshma, thank you so much. That was really excellent. And I think we all appreciate the detail and even the chemistry equations that you were able to share. So thank you so much for being with us and for presenting that. We always have a few questions from Open Air, and then we are going to open it up to audience questions. I see that we have several very good and specific questions in the Q&A box. So everyone, please continue to put those there. We always like to say, Greeshma, if you don't mind unsharing your screen, we can, so that everyone can see you when you're talking. Perfect. You talked about an inquiry from Nucor that kind of maybe prompted the specific idea for company formation for Carbon to Stone. Maybe you wanted to kind of take a step back and can you tell us a little bit about your personal intellectual journey to carbon removal? I know you were at Columbia for many years with Dr. Lackner and Peter Kellerman, who are kind of CDR pioneers. Were you thinking about carbon removal then? Maybe tell us a little bit about how that kind of intellectual evolution happened.
That's a great question, Toby. So Columbia is a fantastic place for research related to carbon management. And at that time when I was there, Professor Lackner really spearheaded some of the early stage innovation around DAC technology. So I'm very grateful for that. The project that I specifically worked on was looking at high temperatures and high pressures for mineralization. So if we were to inject CO2 into the subsurface environments, would we actually be able to convert olivine into carbonates? And if yes, then what would be the time scale of that? So my work effectively went into showing that we're able to mineralize more than 85% of olivine at 185 degrees centigrade, CO2 partial pressures of 150 atmospheres. So you really needed the subsurface to pull off something like that. There's no way, I mean, I wouldn't say no way, there are engineered ways to get around that. But for the LCA and for the tech to really work, we needed to come up with an alternative solution. And the bottleneck here is really the CO2 solubility. So I thought very long and hard about how to overcome this challenge of CO2 solubility. So we could actually build a process above ground as opposed to in the subsurface. We need both solutions, by the way. So that intellectual thought really led me to explore coupling this with CO2 capture technologies, because oftentimes the folks who work on storage and mineralization don't necessarily look at CO2 capture. And the folks who work on CO2 capture don't look at storage and mineralization. But I thought this would be a very unique way to marry that, particularly because mineralization is a thermodynamically downhill route, right, as opposed to an uphill route. So if there's ways in which we can harness that energy to regenerate the solvent and convert that CO2 into a carbonate, that would be neat. So we went into the lab, we tried a couple of experiments. We were starting to get high rates of mineralization. We were able to regenerate the solvent. So things seemed to be working. And so we dug deeper. Then we started asking ourselves the questions: which solvents would work? How would they scale? What are the bottlenecks? And so that's kind of where we are at this point. And then we started asking our questions of what actually happens to all the different metals that's present in these alkaline residues from an environmental justice standpoint, right? So if we mineralized a lot of these residues, and if the nickels and the chromiums ended up in the solution phase, how would we remediate that? And at the same time, there's this increasing realization that we need to achieve independence as far as energy critical metal recovery is concerned. So all of those thoughts kind of collided at the same time to a place where we felt comfortable taking this technology and moving it forward towards commercialization.
That's great. Thank you for that context. I think it's super helpful to hear about how these companies come to form, just from a personal, at a personal level. Switching gears a little bit, one thing that I think is increasingly apparent to people who work in the sector is that carbon removal at scale is ultimately a logistics business, based in science, but ultimately we're going to be having to move millions of tons of mass, ultimately billions of tons of mass. And like looking at your process, depending on the CO2 equivalent concentration of the carbonate, it's going to be 40 plus truckloads of carbonate material per 1,000 ton of carbon removal, 40,000 truckloads per megaton, and the numbers just keep getting bigger. Can you talk a little bit about how you, from a commercial perspective at Carbon to Stone, think about this scale, and how you, coming out of academia with a very small team, how are you going to tackle this challenge?
That's a great question. So the way I think about this is not thinking about the problem in an isolated manner, but also comparing and contrasting with some of the other solutions that exist right now. So the solutions that exist right now are capturing CO2, producing a high purity stream of CO2, and then putting that into a pipeline, sending that off to a site where the CO2 can be stored in a safe, secure, and a permanent manner. That solution is great as long as there is resource availability. When I say resource availability, I'm really talking about the availability of geologic storage facilities, something that the southern part of the United States has a lot of, but not necessarily in the Northeast where we are, right? And also in heavily populated regions, there are concerns about, public acceptance, NIMBY, and such. So with that perspective, really led me to think a little bit more broadly in terms of this tech and the solution. And I think we arrived at a point where there are a few key points. The first is that carbonates are needed in construction materials, not so we can calcine them and produce calcium oxide, but so we can use them as aggregates in their form. Sure, they're never going to replace 100% OPC, but at least if we can replace a small fraction of cement, that goes a long way towards building decarbonization. And we know that carbon management in the context of buildings is not a trivial challenge at all. It's a challenge. It's, concrete and cement are some of the most consumed materials in the world. So if you can try and replace or integrate anthropogenic CO2 into that, that can actually have, more than 10 to 20% impact in terms of the carbon footprint of those materials. So that's one component. And where we are in the Northeast, we really need those building materials, right? So that's one fact. The second fact is that there's a lot of energy critical metals that are present in these systems. So if we just mineralize these materials for the sake of mineralization, we just leave behind a lot of valuable metals that could otherwise help support the energy transition. So in the interest of having the Northeast be self-sufficient and independent in terms of critical metal supply and recovery, it's worth exploring all of the residues that we have. And we can take these learnings and start to implement them in different regions. Now, coming to the question of scale, if we are interested in implementing geologic storage, it just makes sense to have a centralized stack facility with one pipeline going straight to geologic storage. But the way we see this playing out with our industry partners is to actually try and develop modularized stack units, which is something that Klaus Lattner is a big proponent of, which is, really an inspiration from my days at Columbia, is to think more creatively about DAC solutions. So this could be really a play in the modular DAC space. And there's plenty of wonderful companies that are developing scalable, centralized DAC facilities. We need all of them. But where we see this in the context of industrial decarbonization and building decarbonization is really modularized units. So our assessment has really led us down that path. And I think there is a need here. It also helps with remediating vast quantities of mine tailings that exist, as well as brines that exist, oil and gas brines and different types of brines. So really, I'd see a future in distributed DAC systems.
So do we. We love that. And I think Chris is going to put a few links to some past, this is CDRs. We had Habiba Zarabadi, who is one of Klaus's students, come present about a modular DAC and scaling down the cost. And also a friend of Open Air, Naeem Merchant, wrote a great post about modularity on his blog, Substack, The Carbon Curve. So we are with you on that. And also, I think the fact that you are going to be partnering with incumbent industry that is already moving megatons of mass, that I think is a great, also partial answer to the scale question. I'm going to ask one more it's going to be a big complex question, but and then we have a bunch of really great questions in the audience Q&A that we're going to get to. But you mentioned DAC hubs and huge opportunity, $3.5 billion of funding to 4 hubs. Chris will put some information on the DAC hubs in the chat. I think every DAC company is thinking about it. The most specific thing that has come to light actually was last week, which is a really amazing California DAC hub proposal that involved, I think, 27 different organizations, commercial entities, universities, municipalities, state governments, state agencies. Can you talk a little bit about what a DAC hub in New York might look like? We hadn't really, I think people had thought a DAC hub for New York would not be that promising just because of the lack of geological storage options for CO2 in the state, but your process obviates that question, delivering carbonates. You mentioned your industry partners, but would love to kind of hear, just obviously you could talk all day about this, but maybe just a quick framing out about how you look at the DAC hub opportunity, both in terms of institutional partners, state government, commercial partners, and also I think really critically, environmental advocacy and environmental justice organizations, which I think FECM is really rightly prioritizing as part of the application process.
Toby, thank you so much for that question. So really 3 key thoughts here. The first is supporting industries with their mission to reduce not just their CO2 emissions, but also their alkaline waste emissions and also their water emissions that tend to be rich in calcium and magnesium. there is a legitimate need here, as opposed to just sending it to a conventional wastewater facility, treatment facility. There are opportunities here where we can couple DAC with sustainability of industries and making them more cleaner, more greener, reducing landfilling here in New York State and also in the neighboring states. So this solution tackles many aspects that are not conventionally associated with carbon management. It tackles the challenge of looking at various waste streams, not simply from the perspective of waste, but from the perspective of resource. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is that there is admission that it's going to be difficult to make green steel based off of offshore wind. And this is not something that I am saying. This is something that Lara Skinner, who runs the Climate Jobs Initiative at Cornell University, said. This is based on her analysis looking at clean jobs. So if there is going to be dependence even on biomethane, forget natural methane, even if it's biomethane, there's going to be CO2 emissions. And the question is, even if we were to switch to renewables, there are past CO2 emissions that New York State industries and stakeholders have been responsible for. It's time to take back some of that responsibility and implement DAC in a way that is unique, in a way that is really customized to the resources and the needs of New York State. So that would be my second perspective. And the third perspective is that, there's a lot of institutional knowledge, particularly in a place like Cornell, around clean jobs, climate jobs, environmental justice considerations, how we develop a framework for implementing a technology like this while taking into considerations underserved communities, what such a technology might actually mean, not only for high-skilled jobs, but also to the communities that live in those regions. I think this is a fantastic time to aggregate all of that information and synthesize it and think about, in a very systematic manner, what DAC means for hard-to-abate emissions. And one aspect that I will add here is that carbonates can actually be used in soil liming as well. They can actually help improve agricultural productivity, which is something that our farmers really need. So there is an aspect of the rural resilience and agricultural sustainability that actually can be roped into this from the perspective of the uses of the carbonates. So that's something that I just wanted to put out there in terms of thinking more holistically about the urban and the rural nexus in New York State.
And just, can you, before we switch to audience questions, something you said earlier that I thought was very exciting. Can you just talk very quickly about returning to use the old Hudson River as a potential nexus for transport of material and mass and volume from upstate, downstate? It's kind of a cool idea.
It is. So Ben Furness at Cornell actually mentioned this in the passing, that there could be potential for how we view transportation in an unconventional sense. Oftentimes in our LCA models, we consider truckloads of materials, right? But if we do have a DAC processing facility that is located close to a river body, then why don't we simply, harness the Hudson River as a means for transporting these materials to the places that actually need it the most? Why not, right? It's a very unconventional thought, but it's worth considering.
Yeah, that was a cool idea. All right. Thank you so much. I would love to be able to ask more questions, but I want to give some time to the audience, and Megha is going to come on and start asking you some of those. And they're pretty good ones, so look forward to this.
Yeah, so I wanted to start with some of the more technical questions. Maybe first, just kind of as an intro, could you just kind of run through what are the key differences between your technology and conventional DAC and capture technology? And this person was particularly interested in the use of solvents. They were saying they thought that this technology wouldn't use a solvent, but it looks like it does. So, what are the differences on that front, especially?
So the technology that I'm showing here does use a solvent because the concentration of CO2 in air is so low. And if you actually have to capture the CO2 and hydrolyze it in some form, you need some kind of alkaline source. So that hydroxide can be generated electrochemically through water splitting, which is what some folks are doing. Here we use a solvent, which is basic in nature, which helps capture the CO2. So there are really two ways in which that can be done. Then on the regeneration piece, we do have a patent on electrochemical regeneration of the CO2 from alkaline carbonates. So what that does is, instead of treating this as a removal solution, it becomes a pure DAC play, in that we take the solid carbonate, put it in an electrochemical system, and out of that we get relatively pure CO2, and then we regenerate the calcium or magnesium oxide or hydroxide, and then we kind of loop that through. So if we did that, that doesn't, it's another solution on the table, but it's not really a permanent removal solution anymore, right? So that's another aspect to consider. In terms of other DAC technologies, there is solvents. So ours is solvents integrated with mineralization, what I just showed, but you don't have to use solvents. You could split water, generate your hydroxide ion, use that to capture more CO2. That's also feasible. There is sorbents, which is what Climeworks does. So they have an engineered sorbent to capture CO2. And then you could have a temperature swing or a pressure swing to regenerate that CO2. There is what Global Thermostat does based on technology that's developed at Georgia Tech, which I believe is also a sorbent-based technology. There's other solvents that can be used. There's reactive crystallization that Oak Ridge National Lab and Holocene are looking to commercialize. So there they make they capture the CO2 and they precipitate out an organic solid. So the CO2 capture happens in a solvent, but then the end product is an organic carbonate, and that organic carbonate is heated to 100 to 120 degrees centigrade, I believe, to regenerate the CO2 and then reproduce this hybrid material that can be used for more CO2 capture. So these are all different solutions that exist. It's not to say one is better than the others. It's really about the need and being able to customize for that need, being able to look strategically at some of the, I would say, energy needs and life cycle emissions, and determining who the right kind of partners would be for a technology like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. And you were talking about the solvents, and another person asked, when you say that there's solvent regeneration every time you go around, I think you mentioned 90% regeneration. Is that like per pass round you get 90% back, or is that in a longer time frame? Okay. And then what happens to the used up solvent that doesn't get regenerated?
So there is regeneration and there's recovery, right?
Right.
So the recovery is making sure that we are not losing too many drops of the solvent every time we run a process, right? So typically there can be 1 to 2% of losses. So you really need super efficient filtration systems to get that every single drop out. There's going to be some kind of losses there. So that's the recovery piece of it. The regeneration piece of it is that, we've basically completely stripped off the CO2 that's on the solvent. And now we've regenerated the solvent to its pristine state so we can reuse it over multiple cycles. So the recovery piece, it requires innovative filtration systems, and the regeneration piece is actually not as critical as people think it is. So even if there's a little bit of CO2 that's hanging, that's there, as long as you build your reactor systems to handle that, that leftover and the carryover CO2, it's not a deal breaker in my point of view, right? But the recovery piece is important. The regeneration piece is tied to your alkalinity again. So if you have a lot of alkalinity, if you have high purity calcium, magnesium hydroxide, then yeah, you'll get most of your solvent regenerated, which is what you want. But even if there is a little bit of CO2 hungover, it's not a deal breaker from my point of view.
Right. Okay, makes sense. Someone else wanted to know what sources of industrial slags have you been researching, and what kind of impact do the different ones have on the output of the process?
That's a great question. So there's in the iron and steel industry, there's effectively two kinds of broad classes of slags. One is a blast oxygen furnace slag, and the other one is electric arc furnace slag. So blast oxygen furnace slags, if I'm saying, or BOF slags as they're known, and people who are slag experts can correct me on this if I'm wrong, those come from some of the more conventional furnaces. But now they're starting to electrify a lot of the furnaces in iron and steel making. So over the course of the next 10, 20, 30 years, it's mostly going to be EAF slags that are going to be generated. Now, there are some differences in the compositions. There are some, yes, it's a basic oxygen furnace. Thank you for the person who posted that. There are going to be some differences in compositions. There are some differences in the morphologies of these materials. So we tend to look at both BOF slags from the perspective of legacy emissions because our tech can handle that. But we also look at EAF slags because they're the more rapidly growing class of slags, if you would. So underneath EAF slags, we have the conventional EAF slags, and we also have other types of slags that are known as the LADO slags, which is something that Nucor produces. So conventional slags have about 30% or so, 30 to 35% calcium magnesium content in them. And the LADO slags have more than 60% calcium magnesium content. They have very, very different reactivities. So when you're looking at developing your DAC facility, the alkaline resource that you're looking to handle plays an important role in terms of the size and in terms of the processing of the facility and the flow rates and things like that. So it's a good question that the compositions are an important consideration because they are. The question is, how do we develop a tech platform that can handle a wide range of different heterogeneous mixtures without having to go and rebuild one for every single composition? So that's a design challenge right now. It's an intellectual challenge, it's a process challenge, and if you can solve that, we'll be very excited.
Great, thank you. I am going to just quickly ask a couple on the commercial side as well. So I think first of all, are you thinking about licensing this technology, having others build the facilities, or is the next step for you to actually start thinking about building full-on facilities on your end?
We're looking to develop the first, I would say, the first set of pilot scale studies in collaboration with our industry partners. We're looking to do it ourselves. As we go along, if there are opportunities to sub-license, we'd be interested in exploring that further. At this point, we'd be interested in, we are interested in de-risking as much of this as we possibly can, developing a tech platform that can be applied across a wide range of different alkaline streams, wide range of different metal recoveries, for example. And then, the business development side can chug along, if I may say that, while we continue to develop the tech. But yes, nothing is off the table at this point.
Okay, great. Maybe just one or two before we go. I think one thing that's obviously going to be important to a lot of these kinds of companies is, the 45Q credits and the changes that have come about in the Inflation Reduction Act. How does that kind of play a role in making your approach economically viable? What kind of other policies are you hoping to see? Open Air is obviously interested on the policy side. So what are your thoughts there?
That's a great question. I think a big reason why we went about even establishing the company is because of the confidence that the Inflation Reduction Act gave us. Our numbers work out okay without the Inflation Reduction Act because, we could just implement this process with resources that have high levels of metals in them. And this would be mostly a metal recovery play with maybe a little bit of carbon removal, right? The Inflation Reduction Act kind of turned that on its head and said, hey, look, this is a carbon removal play and a metal recovery play. And it's not the metal recovery just taking precedence over everything else, even though it's very, very important. So that kind of helped put things in a perspective, is to put both of them on an even keel and to say we need both. We need to scale up both, and we need to be smart about how we integrate both technologies. And I think the Inflation Reduction Act really helped put that in perspective. Now, in terms of, I would say, bringing something like this to scale, a big component of this is the economics, but a big component of it is also the community impacts of our technology. So there's quite a bit of outreach that we'll need to continue doing in collaboration with our industry partners to help de-risk that component as well.
Yeah, and maybe just quickly before I let you go, could you talk a little bit about that topic of scale and what you think are going to be the biggest challenges and obstacles as you're thinking about scaling up?
So there's two ways to approach scale. One approach is to say, I'm going to build a centralized DAC facility, irrespective of my alkaline resource. I'm going to produce a high purity CO2 stream. I'm going to ship that CO2 around to whoever needs to use it. And that's perfectly fine. And then there's another aspect of scale where we define scale as being able to produce many, many, many units of DAC, but with smaller DAC capacities, right? And also customizing DAC for a given region and for a given resource. So for example, there are certain regions where there is a lot of geothermal heat that one can use for regeneration. So why not consider that? In areas that have a lot of industrial activity, it makes sense to integrate with waste heat. So why not explore that optionality? There are places where one could consider co-locating a technology like this with modular nuclear reactors. And modular nuclear reactors, in my view, are beautiful because they provide heat, electricity, all the things that you want, they're able to give it to you, right? So you can actually tap into that. And there's also hydrogen that gets produced along the way. So kind of pushing the perspective a bit broader in terms of thinking about scale as not being just one approach where we just build a ginormous DAC facility with a geologic storage site next to it, but also thinking intentionally about co-locating with other industrial sources and co-locating with other energy resources. I think is strategic. Putting something like that together can be a bit of a challenge because now you're looking at, do you use fossil energy? Do you use nuclear energy? Do you use GTOs? So you're looking at collaboration across multiple units. But if something like this could come about, I think that could be quite transformative for how we approach DAC, as well as some of the industrial benefits that DAC can actually unlock, particularly from hard to abate sectors.
Perfect. Thank you so much for being with us. This has been really great. And Toby, whenever you're ready, I think you have some final thoughts.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Megha. And audience, thank you so much for those great questions. Sorry we didn't get to them all, but they were really good. And Greeshma, thank you so much for being with us. It was a great presentation and discussion, and it's just super exciting to learn about new DAC pathways and your innovation with packaging the storage with the DAC. I think is super innovative and very exciting to see, particularly in a state like New York where I live, where we do not have the options to put CO2 underground right now. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Toby, for having me here. And I just wanted to say, let's not rule out the option of geologic storage. If we actually have to put gigatons of CO2 in the subsurface, I think we'll need to maybe keep an open mind, because a lot of this is accounting for past emissions from New York State's activities in the past. So how do we actually go about cleaning up after ourselves? I think from that perspective of answering that question, it's not a bad idea to keep geologic storage on the table. We just don't know where it's going to be, but
yeah. No, your former colleague, Dr. Goldberg, has been working on offshore storage in the New York, New Jersey Bight. We had him on our program last August, and that's just 10 years away, so we don't have time to wait for that. But very exciting. Thank you so much. Best of luck with your potential DAC Hub application and getting the company up and running and off the ground. And it'll be very exciting to watch. So thanks for being with us.
Wonderful to be here. Thanks so much for having me always, and wonderful introduction. Happy to chat and reconnect with some of the audience as questions arise, and let's keep in touch.
Yep. And I did put the contact link from your website in the chat because a number of people asked about how they could get in touch with you. So maybe you'll get some inquiries that way. We're at time. So thank everyone for being with us. We actually are shuffling the schedule a bit for March, and we are off next week from the CDR, but we will be announcing on our Twitter and via Eventbrite the next round of programs on this CDR, which are very exciting. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. And this recording will be posted by the end of the week up on our YouTube, and we'll put it out on our Twitter as well. So thanks a lot, everyone. Thank you, Greeshma. Everyone have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.